Henry VIII was and still is a nasty man. Sure, he was a pinnacle figure in England's policies and politics, but he did single-handedly disrupt century-old systems just to marry somebody else. And more than once at that. And it wasn't just the fact that he was marrying multiple wives, it's the fact that he wanted to divorce a wife for a new one, and some of these divorces were cut off one way compared to the other. In some way he was greedy, trying to create a nation under his standards by a male heir, but as greedy as one might be, he was also a hoarder. His urge to spend and purchase the best of everything drove England into debt. Reports suggest that he spent most of the kingdom's revenue hosting elaborate Christmas parties, as he was so fond of hosting parties that he renovated the kitchens of Hampton Court Palace. The renovated kitchen spread over 55 rooms with cooks who could prepare special meals. At the time of his death, he owned vast amounts of wealth, and the list of the wealth is as follows: 50 palaces, 6,500 hand weapons, 78 recorders, 70 ships, 78 flutes, a virginal, 5 sets of bagpipes, and 20,000 other items. When Henry inherited the throne, he also became the owner of money worth of £375 million. He also derived money from the dissolution of monasteries by imposing taxes on the people, and Henry, being a big spender, resulted him dying by debt as well. On his death, even though he was making bank, on the 28th of January 1547, he had accumulated 50 royal palaces as a mention of the record of the English monarchy, and spent the vast sums on those collections, including those musical instruments and tapestries. But not to mention gambling, as well as the millions he pumped into wars with Scotland and France. When Henry's son Edward VI took the throne, the royal coffers were in a sorry state. Henry was rather paranoid about illnesses and would go to great lengths to avoiding contracting the sweating sickness and the plague, which is something that his older brother did pass away from. He would frequently spend weeks in isolation and steered well clear of anyone he thought might have been the subject to disease, and this included his own wives. When he took his second wife, Anne Boleyn, caught in the sweating sickness in 1528, he stayed away from her until the illness had passed. Henry VIII was also known to self-medicate during his life, and even wrote his own prescription book which detailed how to treat ulcers and reduce inflammation. Joining a free tour in the British Museum, you can see Henry VIII's prescription book, for which he describes his own treatment of ulcers, reading an ointment devised by the King's Majesty made at Westminster, and devised a Greenwich to take away inflammations and to cease pain and heal ulcers, called Grey Plaster. Henry's less than complimentary nickname is a reference to the debasing of the coinage that took place during his reign in an effort to raise funds for ongoing wars against Scotland and France. Henry's chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, decided to add a cheaper metal to coins and thus mint more money at a lower cost. The increasingly thin layer of silver on coins would often wear off where the king's nose appeared, revealing the cheap copper beneath, hinting the name Copper Nose. Music was Henry's greatest passion, and he was not without musical talent. The king was a competent player of various keyboard, string, and wind instruments, and numerous accounts attested to the quality of his own composition. The Henry VIII manuscript contained 33 compositions attributed to the King's VIII's whatever it's called, and rumors have been long persisted that the traditional English folk song Greensleeves was written by Henry for Anne Boleyn, but scholars have confidently ruled out this theory, as Greensleeves is based on an Italian style that only arrived in England long after Henry's death. But fun fact, Henry did have perfect pitch. Speaking from the bank, he'd spend on the people's taxes for meals, and he ate a lot. Henry was 6'2" in height and weighed approximately 200 pounds when he became the king. However, as years went by, Henry indulged much more frequently, and his weight went up to 320 pounds, and his waist measured up to 54 inches. He consumed about 5,000 calories daily, and Henry overweight to the extent that his body couldn't bear his weight anymore. A medical device was constructed to get Henry out of bed, and this device was assisted in getting him off his horse during the later years of his life. Henry became so obese as a result of not being able to exercise as much because of a bad jousting accident, which reopened and worsened a previous injury he had incurred earlier in life. At the time of his death, he weighed 400 pounds, and the measurement for his final set of armor showed that his waist expanded up to 58 to 60 inches in the last years of his life. He developed several health complications as a result, and during his last days he developed ulcers on his legs which were constantly opened and infected. Henry VIII may have also written a theological treatise called Defense of the Seven Sacraments. This was written as a reply to Martin Luther, a criticism of the Catholic Church, and particularly to Lutherans' theology treatise Prelude on the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which criticized some or all of the Catholic sacraments and attacked on the papacy. After all, Henry had a lot of beef with the Catholic Church. Henry was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1538. Excommunication means refusing to give someone communion and disallowing them from being involved with the Church. King Henry VIII authorized the Great Bible, the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, to be read aloud in church, and it was completed in 1538 and went through revisions between 1540 and 1541. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII disbanded monasteries, as we know, had taxed the crap out of them, other Catholic religious houses, and appropriated their income. The monks who surrendered their rewards, while those few who resisted were executed, and Henry's last words were allegedly monks, 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 as this seems pretty strange as at face value, but it makes more sense when you consider the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, I'm not talking about a specific body count when I say this, but which is pretty obvious of his outrageous relationships and the conquest of the male heir, even though throughout his rule he still kept this ruthless behavior, as Henry VIII ordered the death of roughly 72,000 of the English people through the capital punishment during his 38-year reign. Many of whom, including those monks earlier, were being members of the clergy or ordinary citizens and nobles who had taken part in uprisings and protests up and down the country. Victims of the king's reign were either executed by him or killed in his name. The category of the penalties were placed into three sanctions: heresy, treason, and denial of his royal supremacy as the head of the English Church. Of course, this is due to the fact of his other body count. Having to remarry multiple times was considered a big no-no, as the Vatican as a king could not have a queen if the previous was still living. But in the case instance of Catherine, his first wife, she was considered too old to bear any more kids, which is why he married Anne Boleyn. It was reasonable enough for him to break off from the church and make his own. Of course, the people loyal to the church did not approve of this, and had heavy criticisms of the king's decisions, as he would constantly marry, behead, and remarry every woman who came along, claiming they could birth him a son. Although scholars believe it could be roughly 52,000 to 72,000 people he could have executed during his reign, it still doesn't change the fact that you didn't know how to chill on the idea of Y chromosomes in your genome, or lack of, which is why he couldn't probably bear a son. Still, he was able to have one as Edward was born. But still, it doesn't justify the killings of so many people. Either way, his bloodthirsty rampage, he was able to give England one of the greatest rulers of their time, Queen Elizabeth I. And fine, I'll talk about that body count. Yes, of course, when it came to Henry, we gotta talk about the one specific fact that everybody knows him on, was the fact that he couldn't keep to himself. Henry VIII's womanizing reputation has lasted throughout history thanks to his 6 infamous wives and mistresses. In spite of this reputation, we only know of 3 specific mistresses, one of being Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary. Because divorce wasn't allowed within the Roman Catholic Church, Henry wasn't allowed to divorce Catherine of Aragon and remarry Anne Boleyn. To get around this, Henry broke with the papacy in Rome and established a Church of England instead. There's a common belief that Henry married and discarded his 6 wives in quick succession, but that's not exactly true. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, when he came to throne at 17 because he passed away from sweating illness. He died. He married his brother's widow, who passed away from a very young age due to the sweating sickness that I mentioned earlier, and so Catherine of Aragon became his wife at the age of 17. Good guy, Henry, as they remained married for nearly 24 years. That is until their marriage annulled in order to get married to Anne Boleyn, as his shortest marriage was to Anne of Cleves, which lasted 6 months. She's buried in Westminster Abbey, and Henry VIII is said to have referred to Anne of Cleves as the Flanders mare, and a mare is a female horse, so I'm pretty sure this was not a compliment. In fact, he really hated her. Henry was laid to rest at St. George's Capitol in Windsor Castle next to Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, regarded by many as Henry's favorite wife, as Jane was the only one to receive a queen's funeral and birth him a son. 2 of his wives were executed. Catherine Howard was executed for adultery, and Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. Despite denying these charges, she was still executed. 5 men, including the queen's brother, were also executed for treasonous, adulterous, and having intimate relationship with the queen. And the evidence for all of this wasn't great, so we don't really know what happened that day. If anything, if they were all guilty of the crimes they were accused of, or if they were false charges, or Henry just needed to get rid of them. The Groom of Stool was a position in the royal household in charge of the cleaning, and you guessed it, yes, it's the king's backside. I know I mentioned this position many times before in this channel, but hey, that's something gross and you gotta know about it. Specifically, King Henry VIII, among many of his reforms, King Henry VIII introduced his job as he plucked one of the sons of the nobles' families to literally wipe his butt. And although this is a very odd and specific job for a male kin to do, there might have been a suspicion it was to teach a relative who he didn't like that I can make your offspring kiss my kiss my butt. Or maybe the reason he wanted to do so was because maybe family is the only people you can trust. However, those graced with this position would also be required to watch his diet, document them, and then be ready once those bowel movements cha-cha'd their way down. They didn't have baby wipes or baby powder, but they did have to make sure it was clean and dry. They also had to wipe down his buttocks with a sponge or a wet nurse, or just be a glorified butt washer. They were also responsible for helping him urinate and defecate by providing a wash basin, or for them just to use a regular old pot. And considering how unhygienic the medieval times were, I don't think they had latex gloves to protect themselves. This job was actually considered a very respectable job, as this was a direct intimate access to the king. He would live in the castle and earn a great salary, and this tradition King Henry VIII created would then be an ongoing career for the next 400 years. To be fair, this job is equivalent to many medical positions now, as they do, or at least they should pay them well, but at least that's what we should know when it comes to history. And speaking of history, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. Be sure to like and subscribe. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye.